Where does creativity fit into compliance? In more places than you think. Problem solving, accountability, communication, and connection, they all take creativity. Join your hosts, Tom Fox and Ronnie Feldman, on Creativity and Compliance, part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist and the voice of compliance, back with Ronnie Feldman, back for another episode of Creativity and Compliance. Today, we're going to take up the topic of improv, your speak up culture. So first of all, Ronnie, welcome back.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about. This is a subject that's near and dear to me.
So Ronnie, you actually have this as a service offering, and I'm really intrigued on how you can use your professional background in improv, coupled with the techniques, strategies, and tactics you've learned since you've been out on your own with your own company to help move a compliance function forward. So if I can maybe just jump right into it and ask, how does improv help an ethics, compliance, and legal function within an organization?
Sure. I absolutely can geek out on this subject. Improvisation has affected my career. It really changed my worldview, not to sound overly dramatic about it. But first, just for the benefit of the audience, let's define improvisation. So, Tom, have you seen the show Whose Line Is It Anyway, by any chance?
I have.
Yeah, cool. That seems to be one of the more popular shows that was on TV for a while that people seem to recognize. So when I'm talking about improvisation, I'm not talking about making comedy. I'm talking about improv as making things up on the spot, off of the top of your head, in collaboration with others. A real fun fact is that improvisation was actually created in the late 40s and 50s by a woman named Viola Spolin, who's sort of considered the mother of improvisation. And she was using these improv techniques to help immigrant children in the Chicago public school system. So she was using it as a teaching tool. And then her son was named Paul Sills, who ended up founding a theater company called the Compass Players that ultimately became the Second City. So improvisation, if you think of applied improvisation, was originally a teaching tool used for people's communication skills that was eventually applied to theater and then eventually applied to comedy.
Ronnie, it sounds like that improv is in the DNA of Chicago.
Well, it is. It absolutely is. It's everything originated from the University of Chicago. That's where the Compass Players and Second Cities was founded, and then it spread out to the coasts. And obviously, in this day and age, at least in my world, I feel like improv has continued to infuse itself into the business world because I think there are a lot of lessons that we can take. Which is, I guess, the point of this discussion. So to refocus us back in, what I'm suggesting is that the things that improvisers do on stage to make comedy are muscles that you can learn. And these are things like how to be more present, how to be a better listener, how to increase awareness of your communication style, both verbal and nonverbal, how to make connections with people and bridge alignment so that you can build solutions together, how to be more adaptable and agile, how to diffuse emotional situations. So the phrase that I love the most that helps try and connect this for perhaps the listeners on this podcast is applied improvisation is like yoga for your communication skills. I love that phrase.
Now that you have introduced this as really a communications tool and a training tool, it makes much more sense to me how you are able to use this so effectively to help companies further their compliance goals. So could you give maybe an example of how improv can help employees or managers in managing difficult conversations?
Tom, if I may, I'm going to start one step back from that, and then we'll advance to that. First, I want to talk about how this can be applied to ethics, compliance, and legal teams, because I feel like there's a natural connection there. And for people who've listened to this podcast before, you've heard me talk about not wanting to be the office of no. how ethics and compliance, by the definition of those terms, are often scary for employees. So when you think about improv for ethics and compliance and legal, we're talking about how do you communicate in a way that's maybe a little bit more welcoming and approachable. So these are soft skills that we're talking about. One of the ways that improvisers do this on stage is that we don't think about the funny thing that we're about to say, or we're not really focusing on the clever quip. What we're really doing is focusing on other people. We talk about improv as being the art of being others focused. So what that means is, if you're focusing on your partners and your scene partners on stage, you can truly be present. And what that does is gets rid of the judgment that goes on in your head. It's actually very Buddhist in a way. Like Buddhism, they always say, like, when you're anxious, you're thinking about the future. You're depressed, you're thinking about the past. And when you're in the present, you're at peace. It's the same thing in improv. If you're off thinking about your answers to the person that's talking to you, you're not actually listening to what they're saying. You have to be present. So one of the first exercises we teach people is a pretty simple idea called active listening. And essentially that just means listening to understand and not waiting to talk, which sounds very obvious and open. Now, if you're on stage and you're constantly thinking about, I got to say something funny right now, you're not paying attention to the person across from you, and you're missing all sorts of social cues. So there's lots of reasons for an ethics, compliance, and legal person to be thinking of the solution. Like if someone says, hey, can I accept this gift from a vendor? It's a new car. And your answer immediately is like, no, you can't do that. But really what you should be doing is thoughtfully listening to what they're saying. And then a little tip is repeat the last word that they just finished their sentence with, and do that in your head silently. Because what that forces you to do is listen all the way to the end before you start thinking of your answer. And by doing that, you're not off in your head losing focus. And people are perceptive. They can see when you're not listening. And it's a little thing that undermines trust. Another quick tip before I pause and let you chime in, Tom, is we talk about improvisers being grateful for information. So when you're on stage and you don't know what's going to happen, you have to be aware of everything that's going on around you so that you can pick up on it. You don't want to miss someone's teeing you up for a nice bit, and you don't want to miss it. So we say when someone's talking to you in the regular everyday world, again, listen all the way to the end, repeat their last word, and say a silent thank you. What it does is a really interesting thing. If you're in the mindset of being grateful and of saying thank you for sharing whatever you've just shared with me, whether you agree with it or not, it puts you in a different mindset of not jumping in and saying yes, no, or otherwise, or it puts you in a framework of saying, oh, thank you for sharing that. Now let me think about how I feel about that. I lied. I'm going to go one step further before I pause. The one rule, if you know anything about improv, is called yes and. If you look up, Tina Fey talks about yes and, Amy Poehler talks about yes and. Any improviser talks about yes and. It's sort of the fundamental tool of improvisation. What that means is on stage, you all have ideas. You're going to make something up on stage. But when somebody offers up a statement, you have to implicitly drop your idea, agree to that reality on stage, and add one thing. And the other person then drops their idea, agrees and adds, drops your idea, agree and add. So in this context, what we would say is yes and is not agreement, but validation. So think of the yes as the head nod, the repeating back what you just heard. I hear what you just said, and I'd like to offer my perspective on things. What happens in ethics compliance is that you're often referred to as the office of no, because you say no all the time. But there are ways to say no without using those words. What people really crave is validation, and improvisers are really good at validating. So I hear you, I understand, and now I'm going to look for a solution that we can solve together. So wrapping all that up, that's listening to understand, don't wait to talk, be grateful for information and focus on the other person, validate and add. Does that all make sense, Tom?
It does. Ronnie, one of the other podcasts I have is around business leadership. And the one key concept it seems to be across the board for business leaders is to listen. In a lot of studies of compliance programs, it turns out that employees want to be able to go in their supervisor's office and raise a concern. They don't necessarily want to input something into the hotline. They don't want to send an email to the CEO. They want to be able to go into their supervisor's office. And many mid-level managers are really feel unprepared to have that role as intake. It seems to me that one of the things you're talking about is what you term creating a listen-up culture. How can improv help the middle manager learn how to listen up so that you're not training leaders on communication, but you're training the people in the middle of the corporation who employees want to go talk to about cares or concerns?
Yeah, well, you're spot on with that. I'm trying to. It's interesting to try and explain improvisation through a podcast because it's such an interactive, experiential art form. And for years, I worked for the Second City for 10 years, and we did these workshops all over the country, and I've continued to try and adapt them for this community as I've branched off to create learnings and entertainment. A lot of the skills that we just talked about in relation to how it can support ethics, compliance, and legal it's almost the same exact thesis statement for how you would help management. Because really, these are just soft skills. These are communication skills, and improv is a fun way, an interactive way to teach these very fundamental lessons. So you can say, hey, listen all the time. Hey, be a good listener. Everyone's like, yeah. But the little tips that I'm telling you right now about listening all the way to the end and repeating the last word, saying a silent thank you, finding a way to yes and every conversation, these are actually practical tools that you can use. So in the same way we just talked about this for legal professionals, these are just leadership and communication skills. You want a manager, you want a leader, the higher up you go, you're more intimidating to the average employee. So what we're talking about is these little social cues and tips that you can use to make yourself more approachable. I'll give you a quick example. The difference between the word should and could is really interesting and powerful. It sounds so subtle, but we'll do these little exercises where we make people give advice to each other in little groups. We're like, pair up and find yourself a partner, and we want you to give advice, but the only rule is you have to say, well, you should do this, and you should do that. And then we pair them up again, and we make them do it, and we have them use the words, well, you could do this, and you could do that. And then we do this really interesting thing. We make everybody, I just did this the other day. We had a couple hundred people in the room, and I said, everybody close your eyes. And if you were a statue, show me what the word should looks like. And everybody opens their eyes, and there's 100 people all pointing their fingers straight out of the air. It's really powerful. I was like just literally finger wagging. And then we do it again, and we say, close your eyes. And if you were a statue, show me what the word could looks like. And then everybody opens their eyes, and there's, usually 99 times out of 100, you have some sort of open pose. So that's a perfect example of how a little subtle word change can make a more open communication style, because nobody likes to be told what to do. Nobody likes a finger wag. They much prefer to solve problems together collaboratively, and that helps build trust. So a manager doing that, a compliance professional doing that is a really helpful thing.
Ronnie, I'd like to pick up on your last sentence where you used the word trust. Culture has become more, I don't want to say more important because I think it was always important, but it's been recognized as a key component actually of a compliance program. And in its most recent pronouncement, the Department of Justice in its 2019 evaluation of corporate compliance programs talked about corporate culture, measuring culture, assessing culture, improving culture. It also really helps speak to institutional fairness, the word trust. So I was wondering if you had some thoughts on how improv can help, not so much in creating the trust that you just articulated, but how it can help employees to have more respectful communications, both up and down the chain, but also help where emotions may be riding high for some corporate issue, and just really around that.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Sorry to interrupt you there. I didn't listen to my own rules. So these are always muscles you got to work at, right? You get excited to jump in and provide a solution, and then you end up interrupting people, and that's something that erodes trust. So I apologize. Well, everything. It's funny, Tom. When you asked me to do this podcast with you originally, I started thinking about what I wanted to communicate to this community, and it always centers around corporate culture. I'm a firm believer that the way that we all can have an active hand in shaping our culture by how we choose to communicate. And most of the things that we've been talking about on this podcast have been more organizational-wide communications, through videos, through e-learning, through different communication campaigns. And I'm a firm believer that those are ways that you can slowly and subtly shape culture by being more open, more positive. Even one of the quotes I said in a couple podcasts ago was from John Cleese, who said, humor is one of the quickest ways to get people from the closed mode to the open mode as quickly as possible. Okay, that was a big preamble. But one of the things from an improv standpoint that I've found a really interesting way to adapt this for an employee population, particularly around there's so many trigger words right now that people are polarized politically. There's the Me Too movement. There's a lot more awareness about diversity and inclusion. There's just a lot of minefields in the workplace. And I think the one thing that companies can do is actually provide skills to employees, little tricks, little tools to help them navigate these minefields. And I think improv workshops and keynotes are an effective and fun way to get at these very serious subjects. So I guess when I think about improv for the general employee population, I think of how can we communicate respectfully even when we disagree? Actually, I had a client who they use the term, we want to teach people to celebrate disagreement, to welcome disagreement. I actually love that phrase because it's about doing it. You don't have to agree, but how can we communicate positively even when we don't? So some of the things that we talked about before, the active listening, the culture of thank you, saying yes and, these are things that all can be applied. So for instance, the first little tip I told you about listening all the way to the end and repeating the last word and then saying a silent thank you. One of the things that little thing does is it pauses you and allows you to postpone judgment. It allows you to respond versus react. When someone says something that's triggering to you, the first response is to go, no, what are you talking about? Again, we hit that word no again. What we should really be doing is take a moment, put that pause in there, assume positive intent, validate, and then find a bridge. So even the same lessons that I just said, if you were to say something about, a different political spectrum, I can respond by going, that's interesting. I'd like to offer another perspective. And then then we're having a conversation about a difficult thing versus having a difficult conversation. One of the little exercises I like to talk about for this, a different exercise that I haven't shared yet is we'll split people into groups, and we'll say, all right, you're going to have a debate about something, and we pick something benign like, salty snacks or sweets. Go find a partner, and we're going to have this debate. And the only rule the first time is we say, you have to start your sentence with, that's wrong because. And so we watch people have these things, salty snacks are better because I like to eat chips and they're so much more tasty. And they're like, well, that's wrong because chocolate is awesome. And we watch them have these little, dynamic, and it gets really heated quick. And even it's about something really not important. And then we do it again, and we say, all right, now replace it with the phrase, that's important because. And they do it again. And then the next thing you know, they're like, well, I think salty snacks are better because who doesn't like barbecue chips? Barbecue chips are the best. And they go, oh, well, that's important because, gosh, salt makes you want more, and salt is tasty. But I think, sweets are better because, chocolate is amazing, and it's my lifeblood. And you go, oh, well, that's important because you want to feel good sometimes a day. Now, what you've done there is you've allowed a moment to validate the other opinion, but you have not necessarily agreed with it. And again, that little phrasing helps you have a conversation about a difficult thing versus a difficult, combative conversation. What do you think about all that?
Wow. Ronnie, unfortunately, though, we are near the end of our time for this episode. Gosh, this has just been great. I'm really looking forward to maybe exploring some of these a little more in depth later. But thanks so much. And you want to take us home?
Yeah. So, I guess I'll leave you with this. These are skills that we can all work on and get better at. There's a lot of different ways to get there. My toolbox happens to include improvisation. I think it's just a really fun and interesting way to get at these lessons. So around the country, there's a lot of improv theaters that can do this. Go take an improv class. You will love it. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Creativity and Compliance. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to subscribe and leave a review.